Good evening and welcome. My name is Kirill Gerstein, and you've joined Kirill Gerstein Invites, an online forum hosted by Kronberg Academy. We are all in various places, but together in this virtual space. I am today in Prague, in the beautiful Rudolfinum, the home of the Czech Philharmonic. Emma is in England, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to the seminar with Emma Smith. Emma is a foremost scholar of Shakespeare, among many things. She is a professor of Shakespeare studies at Hertford College at the University of Oxford. She has published widely on the first folio, the first collected works of Shakespeare, and there's a new book on the first folio. I understand she's preparing for publication, and she does podcasts on Shakespeare, among other things, and of course her book, This is Shakespeare. And it's particularly fitting, not that we have a fetish with birthdays and anniversaries, but this is the week of Shakespeare's baptism, and you just heard some Prokofiev, an excerpt from Romeo and Juliet, and it was recently Prokofiev's birthday, so very fitting. And Emma and I were just joking about one of the very few rare slips that Shakespeare makes, where he talks about the Bohemian coastline. Well, so I'm in the Czech Republic, and the coastline is not quite to be seen, but there we go. And I think much to learn from Emma, and I'm delighted to welcome her to our forum.
Thank you, Kirill. Thanks ever so much, and thank you everybody for beaming in and joining us. It's one of the wonderful privileges of this awful time we're in to actually be able to make some connections that wouldn't be possible, and I'm really grateful for that. I'm going to talk about Shakespeare as Collaborator, and I'm going to do it in 3 sections, maybe with a chance for some sort of discussion and question and answer in between each section, so that it's not a great lecture or sort of brain dump from me and then you asking some questions at the end, but that we get as much as we possibly can of a conversation.
Yes, and I monitor your questions in the chat or in the Q&A as you'd like, and we'll weave them into Emma's discussion.
That's great, yeah. And because I'm talking about things that I think and study a lot about, I can easily stop and regroup or redirect according to what you're interested in. I haven't got a script that we've got to get through, come what may. And one of the things I'm particularly interested in, this audience with diverse backgrounds and diverse professional interests, is actually something of a steer perhaps about collaborative working in your own environment or in areas of endeavor that you know about. One of the things that I think has been missing in the academic discussion of Shakespeare as a collaborator, that I'm going to go on to talk about, is a wider sense of what that means now and what that could have meant then. I've had some great recent discussions with people who are in the writing room for modern TV serial drama, with people who are transposing and working on musical scores and sort of rebooting those for performance and now, or performance with different instruments and so on. People who have taken up the life's work of someone who has sadly died, and brought that to publication in a way, trying to think about what that person would have wanted and would have done had they been able to do it. These are really fascinating practical insights for me. So if you have anything like that where you want to compare it to team working or some other form of collaboration, that would be extraordinarily helpful for me. So don't feel it has to be absolutely sort of Shakespearean and historical. Okay, so the first thing is to talk about just briefly why I chose this topic, and why I talked in the brief paragraph that I gave to Kirill about taking Shakespeare from a pedestal. I'll start here because actually one person took Kirill to task on Twitter about that and said it made me sound very sneering and that I was trying to take Shakespeare down a peg or two. And that was very interesting to me. It's not actually my intention to do that, but I do think that if Shakespeare's on a pedestal, we can't reach him. We can't engage with him. We can't, we're looking up all the time, and he's sort of looking down on us. That doesn't seem to me a way to address the sort of creative and critical challenges of Shakespeare in the modern age. So I am trying to get Shakespeare down off that pedestal, or perhaps I'm trying to give a leg up to a whole lot of other people from his own time, but also more recently, who deserve to share some of the limelight. You know, in that way, I want to see Shakespeare a bit more like an Oscar winner who gets on stage and then has a great long list of all the people without whom this wouldn't have been possible. I think that maybe great minds have just thought alike, and Wayne has put that in the chat, thinking that Shakespeare might accept the award for greatest world dramatist. I'd be happy to give him that award. My taking him off a pedestal doesn't mean I'm not thoroughly in awe of that genius. Does nevertheless, I think, want to try to understand that genius as the product of a collaborative environment. It's a later model of literary creativity that imagines that the scholar, that the poet is alone in his garret or alone in his writing room. In some ways, Virginia Woolf's feminist restatement of that, A Room of One's Own, has corroborated the sense that to be a poet, to be an artist, you need solitary time, uninterrupted time, time on your own to commune with the muse. I don't think that's how Shakespeare would have understood writing, and I don't think that the theatre is a place for that kind of writer, the theatre then or now. One of the things that I enjoy most about Shakespeare's biography, such as we know it, and it's something that we've talked about a lot during this long pandemic year, is that when the theatres are closed for the plague in the early part of Shakespeare's career, in 1593 to 4, Shakespeare's hardly really made a mark at all as a playwright at that time. He is just starting. He's just starting out. He's absolutely eclipsed by his more brilliant contemporary, Christopher Marlowe. And while the theatres are closed, what he decides that he's going to do is that he's going to write two, first one, and then on the success of that, another dramatic poem, which he dedicates to a nobleman, the Earl of Southampton, and which he gets published. And presumably that's a way to try to make some money, to broaden his income stream. Many of us have had to do that during this long year. These are really successful poems, particularly Venus and Adonis, which is the great smash hit of the Elizabethan period, so much so that if you had asked a contemporary about Shakespeare and what they knew about him, I think they would have probably nominated him first as the author of Venus and Adonis. So these are really successful poems that Shakespeare writes. And a poem, I think, is a form in which the author is supreme. They control, they write. We don't really hear of poems being jointly composed. That's a very rare form. But having had this great success, what does Shakespeare do? He goes back to the theatre, where he's hardly made his mark yet at all. He never writes those long narrative poems again, although he does write sonnets throughout his career. And that's to say, I think that Shakespeare was committed to this collaborative world of the theatre. He was committed to an art form in which the words of the writer are only part of the overall impact of the art object, and that feels an important thing to try to reinstate. Sometimes I think that if we called Shakespeare's plays scripts, we would have more of a sense of what's not so much what's missing, but what else is needed to turn them into the three-dimensional multimedia artifacts that they really were. So the first section I'm going to talk about is Shakespeare in the theatre and the theatre as collaboration. In the second section, I'm going to talk about text as collaboration and about writing in partnerships. And then thirdly, I'm going to talk about Shakespeare and adaptation as a kind of collaboration, both Shakespeare as adapter and Shakespeare as adapted. So the first section then, thinking about Shakespeare as a theatre maker. And now clearly anybody who has been involved in theatre or in any kind of live performance has some sense immediately of how many different people's labor goes into making that happen. And only some of them are visible on the stage. So the backstage labor, the labor of costumiers and wig makers, the labor of musicians, as well as of the actors who are on stage, the labor of the shareholders in the Chamberlain's Men, in which Shakespeare too was a sharer. These are all important aspects of the way that the play comes into being. I wanted to dwell on theatre as a collaborative art because of something quite specific about Shakespeare's own working environment. And that's to say that unusually among fellow playwrights, he is effectively a house dramatist for a theatre. Rather than pitching plays around to different theatre companies and sort of touting literary wares wherever he can. In fact, he has a steady gig writing 2, sometimes 3 plays a year for the Chamberlain's Men, later the King's Men. And not only is he a steady part of that enterprise, but so too the actors are a pretty steady and coherent group because of what I already mentioned, that shareholding model. They are bought in to the successes of the theatre. They're bought in to the successes of their collaborative enterprise. And actors tend to stay with the company over a long period. The slight counter to that is the actors in particular who played female roles. You'll know, of course, that all actors on the early modern stage in England were male. It's not entirely clear why that was. Some people sometimes think there was a law against women performing, but there's no obvious law on the statute book. And this is not the same in Europe. Many travelers from England remark when they go to Europe about seeing women actors, female actors performing female roles. What's interesting about those reports, those travelers' reports, is perhaps because they're so shaped by English superiority, they can hardly bring themselves to think that women might be any good at performing women. So when, for example, Thomas Coriat, who's a Jacobean courtier and general, sort of rogue, picaresque kind of rogue, goes to Venice, he sees women performing there, and his phrase is something like, "To my surprise, they were quite good." He doesn't have a moment of revelation that says, "Oh my God, our male actors are just travesties of women." So that suggests that male actors were extremely good at performing female roles, but we can see across Shakespeare's career that he writes different kinds of roles for women in his plays, which seem to draw on the capacities of the actors that are available to him. And more specifically, I think, in the first half of Shakespeare's career, when he writes mostly comedies and history plays, he tends to write parts for women that emphasize their youth, their androgynous nature, and that they're in plots which are heading towards marriage, and they often exploit that bodily androgyny by imposing cross-dressing plots within the fiction of the plays. So in As You Like It, as you'll remember, Rosalind is disguised as Ganymede, in Twelfth Night, Viola as Cesario. That seems to me to draw on the capacities of probably 2 equally good, equally talented young male actors of female roles. In Twelfth Night, Viola and Olivia are equivalent roles. In Midsummer Night's Dream, Helena and Hermia, likewise. In As You Like It, perhaps Rosalind and Celia. They're paired throughout, and that draws on the resource that's available to Shakespeare. Later in his career, though, he starts to write quite differently for women. I don't think that the actor who plays Rosalind could have played Lady Macbeth, and I don't think you would write the part of Lady Macbeth for the same actor for whom you had written the part of Rosalind. It seems clear that somewhere around about 1605 or 6, Shakespeare's company, now under the king's patronage, the king's men, appoint a young male actor, a male apprentice actor, who is very compelling in sexually mature roles and tends to be cast alone. There isn't a female sidekick in these plays. There isn't anybody else to take up the limelight, if you like. This actor needs to stand alone and needs to be, as I say, the kind of a deeply complex, powerful Lady Macbeth, the sexually mature and powerful Cleopatra, or perhaps moving beyond Shakespeare's own plays, the Duchess of Malfi in Webster's tragedy of that name. These are grown-up, sexually powerful women who seem to draw on the talents of a new actor. So I think it's interesting to think about Shakespeare writing very much with the talents and physiques of his actors in mind. It's a great question whether the apothecary at the end of Romeo and Juliet, he's the person from whom Romeo gets the fateful poison, and he's a tiny cameo role. He's described over and over again as very, very thin. He's a sort of skeleton figure, the sort of figure of death. It's hard to know whether the actor who played him was very, very thin, or perhaps was very, very fat. Either could work, but something is being said about the body of the actor. And there are lots of clues like that in Shakespeare's plays. I wanted to link that just briefly with some of the other collaboration that theatre involves Shakespeare in. And I think that's particularly with music. I know there are a lot of musicians, and music making is an important, very, very important strand of this ongoing seminar. So far as we understand it, the early modern theatre did not employ many specialist musicians. And that seems to suggest that actors were musicians themselves, that that it was part of their skill set to be able to sing and to perform with musical instruments. Almost all of Shakespeare's plays make use of music, and they make use of it in sensitive ways, I think, particularly for two particular reasons. One, I think, to manage the pace. So a song can be very static, can slow things down, is a moment of reflection, is a moment out of the sort of plot narrative of the plays. They're moments that the feminist film critic Laura Mulvey called moments of to be looked at-ness, so that they're moments where the plot is not advancing, but we are in this heightened moment of spectatorial engagement with what's happening. So they have an impact on the pace and the reflectiveness of what's going on. And they also have an impact, as music always does, on the tone. Much of Twelfth Night's bittersweet, sweet, sour kind of tone is managed through music. And it's very often the case that the language of the play, the dialogue of the play is pushing towards mirth or merriment, and it's the songs that bring it back to the kind of underlying sadness and wistfulness that's at the heart of the play. There's a great example when the revelers, Toby Belch and Andrew Agutic, ask Feste the melancholy clown for some music, and Feste begins a song which is about come away death, lay me in Cyprus. It's one of those moments where the tone of the play shifts absolutely, and we think that Shakespeare probably drew on well-known ballad tunes. That these were not songs that were new, had new music for them. They were drawing on the associations of popular tunes in a way like a kind of found musical might be, a kind of musical which uses the songs of, I don't know, Queen or ABBA or something to make a story. There's something of that in Shakespeare, but we also think that one of the things that would have been done to revive plays and make them different for a new audience would be to reset the songs, to update the songs with perhaps some more recent music or more up-to-date music. So music is one of the collaborations Shakespeare has with his actors, and we don't know whether Shakespeare himself could play a musical instrument. We now tend to think that he was probably a more accomplished actor than tradition has had it. The tradition was always that Shakespeare couldn't really act very well at all, and was just a writer. Well, not just a writer, I suppose, if it's Shakespeare, but worked it for the company as a writer. But looking at the evidence, we know that Shakespeare acts in the plays by other people, including by Ben Jonson, up to and beyond the year 1600, when he's sort of 10 years into his career in London. If he were going to give up acting, he probably would have done by then, but he obviously hasn't. So he probably did perform in his own plays too, perhaps including with music. So far then, in that section about thinking about theatre, I suppose I've wanted to bring out some of the ways that Shakespeare knows about the theatrical milieu in which he's working, and brings that to the center of his plays. And I'm emphasizing that to start with because there's a long history of Shakespeare criticism which has felt rather embarrassed about Shakespeare's location in the theatre. It's spoken to later ages disdain for theatre, a sense that theatre is not an entirely respectable social or perhaps artistic milieu, and tended to somehow suggest that Shakespeare was a poet, really, a lyric a bard who unfortunately had to work in the theatre because that was how things were in the Elizabethan period. I think of Shakespeare as embracing that and embracing in particular its collaborative energies, that it's precisely because you can't be a lone poetic bard that the theatre appeals so much to Shakespeare. And I think seeing him writing for, thinking about how his actors are going to work with his plays is a really really resituates him in the teamwork that was and is putting on theatre. And there's one perhaps last element of how that shapes his plays that it would be worth talking about now. And I think that's the phenomenon of doubling. Shakespeare's acting troupe was probably about 12 men and 3 boys, with some extras who could do walk-on things or carry on or carry things on, but probably didn't speak. And of course, most of Shakespeare's plays have many, many more speaking parts than those 15 actors can carry, unless they are doubled up. That's to say, unless the actors play more than one role. Now, that may seem an obvious point, but the plays are very, very cleverly arranged and detailed to enable actors to switch between roles. So giving them enough time to get out of costumes particularly when there's no Velcro or easy, zippers or easy fastening or easily unfastening costumes. A costume change is a quite substantial piece of work. So he's good at writing in proper time for that. And sometimes there are moments when characters in plays are just filling in time in order for some manic exertions backstage to get people out of one costume into another. Some of what Puck is saying at the end of Midsummer Night's Dream, I think, is entirely to cover that gap. This was a good time for the clown or the comic actor to come out and improvise and to fill up perhaps 5 or 6 minutes to effect a costume change. So Shakespeare does that technically really well, but he also, I think, plays on it in some really interesting ways. And by that, I mean, he draws attention to the fact that two apparently distinct characters are actually overlapping in some symbolic or psychological ways because they're being played by the same actor. He does that notably in King Lear, where most critics now believe that the actor who played Cordelia disappears from the play, but the character disappears from the play, but the actor stays to play the part of the fool. Another plain talking accompaniment to Lear, and the strange question in the play about what happens to Shakespeare, to Lear's fool, could be answered as much by the need to bring back Cordelia as by any other plot or psychological factors. So that's to say, the fact that both those characters are played by the same actor gives a kind of continuity between them. I don't think it means that they're the same person, but I think it brings a kind of continuity between them. In Midsummer Night's Dream, we can see that the fairy king and queen, Oberon and Titania, are the inverse or dream versions of the Athenian rulers Theseus and Hippolyta, and they tend to be played again by the same actors. And sometimes there's one example that I completely love that I'm going to finish this section on, about how Shakespeare uses doubling and how he plays with our understanding, our knowledge that this is happening. The pleasure of being part of the joke is a great pleasure, isn't it, in being a spectator. And this is at the end of As You Like It. So in As You Like It, there are two dukes, a good one and a bad one. And I think it's pretty clear that they're probably played by the same actor. They're doubled. They're never on stage together. They are really a bit like, Mr. Darling and Captain Hook in Peter Pan, and lots of versions of this later. They're the good dad and the bad dad, and of course, psychically, they're the same person. And this all works really well until the very end of the play, when Duke Senior, who is the father, who's the good one, and is the father to Rosalind, the central character in the play, they've all been reunited in the Forest of Arden, and it's all looking great. And then suddenly a messenger comes to say Duke Frederick, that's to say the bad one, the brother of Duke Senior, is on his way. He's going to come any minute now. And at the level of the fiction, there's a sort of just a slight pause in the play. What role is there for this disruptive, bad, anti-comic character at the end of a comedy? But at the level of the performance, there's this even more profound kind of shock, because how can Duke Frederick come when he is already on stage, but in the character of Duke Senior? It looks like a glitch, a terrible glitch in the actual mechanism of the play. And the only time I've seen it when it was done doubled in this way in the modern theatre, there was a completely exquisite moment where everybody just looked, and they looked at Duke Senior, and he just says, I don't know how it's going to work. And then the messenger comes back and says, Duke Frederick has met a hermit in the forest, and he's made a religious conversion, and he's not coming. I mean, it's a really lame excuse, but it's self-consciously lame. It gets this doubling conundrum solved. So these are all ways that I think Shakespeare revels in the theatre. He chooses it. he is steeped in it, and he is steeped in the kind of teamwork and collaboration that's required to put on a play, a teamwork and a collaboration that I think perhaps will be familiar to many people who are on this call. So I'm going to pause there and invite any kinds of questions or discussion, perhaps about theatre and collaboration, either in Shakespeare's time or more recently, before I move on to talk about sort of writing and text and collaboration.
Oh, thank you, Emma. It's brilliant and fascinating. And while our participants are gathering their thoughts and hopefully questions are forthcoming, I'll lead off with a couple of questions that interested me or came to my mind as you were speaking. One of them being, so you spoke about the female roles being played also by males, sometimes younger males. What is then the historical trajectory in the Shakespearean tradition and generally in theatre? When do you see that starting to change, and how does that change? Is that a steady trend that then women get assigned and play female roles, or are there also historical swings back and forth on this point in theatre?
Thanks, Kirill. Yeah, that's really interesting. So what happens in English theatre, as many will know, is that there is a complete break in 1642 when the parliamentarians take over London and then execute Charles I. So the English Republic, the Puritan Republic, does not allow theatre. And so from 1642 to 1660, there's a complete break in formal public performed theatre. There is probably some underground theatre of different sorts. When Charles II comes back from exile in Europe, he's got a French wife, and he's been quite influenced by French court styles. And one of the things he immediately wants back is theatre, and he wants now the style of performance which is enjoyed in France and elsewhere in Europe, which is mixed sex, women acting. And it's a really interesting question, because I think it bears on why it is that Shakespeare is one of the authors that they turn to at that moment. So Charles says effectively, I want the theatre back next week. And everybody says, oh, my God, where's all the costumes? What are the plays? Who's right? What are we going to do? And certainly Thomas Killigrew, who is given one of the patents for reviving theatre, has a copy of Shakespeare's First Folio. And I think what he thinks is that these female characters in the plays who dress as men, like Rosalind and Viola, who we've already mentioned, will be a real hit if they are actually played by women, because male costume is much more revealing of the female body than female costume. So if a woman is wearing hose and tights, that shows the shape of her legs in a way that you would never see if she's wearing a dress. So he thinks this is going to be part of the new kind of erotics of royalist theatre. And so he picks up Twelfth Night as the first play, which will be performed by women in female roles, and then that really never returns. We never return to a single-sex theatre, except for some forms of sort of historical reconstruction.
Thank you. We have a couple of comments. They're not quite yet questions. D. Terry Williams says it's possible to triple, quadruple parts. Also, this process broadens and deepens the actor's talents. And Lucia or Lucia Imbrogno says, thank you for hosting this event. I was surprised by the absence of a law preventing women from performing female roles. This is a novelty for me. I've always seen it taken for granted, but I've never thought this had to do with a specific preference for men to play these roles. Thank you, Emma, for mentioning it. Another question I wanted to ask you while we're sort of in the territory of practical performance, so to say. I've was fascinated by an interview a couple years ago by David and Ben Crystal. You probably know them, where there's the discussion about the original pronunciation, the research into the original pronunciation, and the argument they were making that, in fact, many of Shakespeare's rhymes and jokes cannot really be enjoyed in a pronunciation that has mutated into what is modern English. Do you feel similarly? Do you disagree? How important is original pronunciation in our perception of Shakespeare today?
Yeah, David and Ben Crystal, who are, in case people don't know them, David is a very distinguished linguist and historian of language, and his son Ben is an actor, and they have been very influential and creative in thinking about what they call original pronunciation, which goes along with so-called original practices, which are kind of historical ways to try to explore what these Elizabethan texts might have been like if you use Elizabethan methods such as we know them. So if you hear original pronunciation Shakespeare, it's almost impossible to listen to. I think I can't imagine that anybody would want to go to that, just because everything is alien, and it sounds like somebody doing a silly voice, which is very tiring after a while. But it's absolutely true that what it does do is to bring out rhymes and puns and things that sounded the same, which we've definitely now lost. My own sense with, in some ways, all kinds of art that has a life beyond its own immediate time frame is that, in fact, we should be prepared to lose some of what it meant to the original, the people who saw it first time around. In some ways, it's part of its long life to leave some of that behind, and there are losses in that. But we bring, I suppose, all kinds of other sensibilities and experiences and expectations and ways of thinking that sort of compensate. So I'm not really a fan of original anything, original practices or original pronunciation. There's been some parallel with the use of period instruments in music, and there are interesting parallels. There are interesting parallels there, but perhaps in the theatre it's been less. It's been revealing about the history, but less satisfactory, perhaps as performance and as art.
Yeah, this is very fascinating what you said, because even in this seminar series we've had some luminaries of historical performance, and there's obviously very, very much to learn. I think in music, historical performance tradition has really changed all the current performing traditions, so to say, and I think positively. But I think it's very beautiful what you said, that artworks that are long lasting should be prepared to lose some of their original meaning. And in that, I wanted to ask you, this is possibly already a bridge to your next section about writing, but how aware do you think Shakespeare was, or how busy was he with posterity? Because some people make an argument that until Beethoven in composed music, it was much more of a thing for now, and that if you take Bach and if you take Mozart, that even perhaps there would be some surprise that they would experience if they would know how long-lasting and how studied and how looked at and examined their works are. But Beethoven was firmly busy and aware of the future and his relationship to it. What about Shakespeare? Obviously much earlier, but a different situation.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating question. And one of the reasons I think Shakespeare prompts so much biographical speculation, and even the question about whether Shakespeare wrote the plays that are attributed to him, the so-called authorship question, is, I think, because he is he's very recessed in his own work. It's very hard to get a sense of Shakespeare himself, there are no, even compared with his contemporary writers, someone like Ben Jonson, for instance, writes lots of prologues and epilogues and other kinds of material that sort of gives an artistic credo or a sense of what he thinks is important. We know that Jonson is very keen to get his his works, not just his plays, published, and that he takes a lot of care over how they appear in print. And it's been a big question in Shakespeare studies how important Shakespeare felt that print publication was of his plays. The old view was that he didn't care about it at all. There has been a kind of pendulum to say he absolutely did care about it, so much so that he wrote longer, more literary versions of his plays that were much too long actually to be performed, in order that people could read and go back over them and enjoy their intricacies in ways that they couldn't do through performance. And my own view on that is, I don't think Shakespeare was indifferent to print at all, but nor does he look like someone who went along to the, did his proofs or did his, prepared his plays with very great care for publication. And that suggests to me that perhaps he is thinking more about the immediate world of performance than he is about the longer world. The counter to that, of course, would be that the sonnets, one of the great themes of his sonnets is that beauty, love, the beautiful young man, these are all ephemeral, and that what will last is words and print. And that does seem to have quite a strong sense of that what the poem makes immortal is not actually the love object, but the writer. It's the sonnet preserves the author rather than the lover.
The words remain. In fact, with this practicality of performance as a whole, there's a question from Christopher Strakos. Is the problem of doubling you describe in As You Like It made worse because Shakespeare wrote the plays as he went along, so to speak, and not presented for performance as a whole, or is this not correct?
I don't think we've got any evidence that Shakespeare sort of didn't go back and sort of sort out his plots, and didn't redraft and didn't rethink. So I suppose I have been thinking that potential glitch with the two dukes that I was talking about was deliberate and was funny and was sort of riffing on the circumstances of performance rather than just a mistake. Because I suppose that I would imagine that kind of mistake Shakespeare would himself pick up, or that someone else would do. So we got the actors who presented the plays in their first collected printed edition that Kirill referred to in introducing me, the so-called first folio. They began this myth about Shakespeare, I think, that he never redrafted anything. He never blotted a word. They said, we've seen his papers, we've seen his original drafts, and it all just comes out of his head. Perfect. And that people believed that for a long time, that Shakespeare was the only writer, perhaps in history, who had not, I think it's Hemingway who says that it's the erasers on the pencils run out before the pencils, because you're always making corrections. Writers do running corrections, and I think Shakespeare did do that.
So perhaps two small questions from this section before we let you move on. Edward Smith just asked, since you referred to manuscripts, is it right that there are no extant manuscripts of Shakespeare's own hand?
I'm going to talk about that, Edward. I would say yes, it is right, but there is a one slight counter to that, which I'll cover in the next section.
Okay, and one from Julia Reimer or the Reimer. Sorry if I mispronounce the names, always a general disclaimer. Does the notion of scouting actors, perhaps to join the troupe, maybe because the story play being imagined requires someone that's not in the present troupe, does that ever happen that one can trace back? Maybe that's harder to find actual evidence of, just thinking of how a repertoire company now might bring in an actor to play a particular part. So
yeah, that's a really, really interesting question. And you're right that we don't have much evidence about it, but we can see that there's a point in Shakespeare's, the life of Shakespeare's company, where there is a transition between two different comic actors. The first one is called Will Kemp, and he is a improvisatory, physical comedian, much loved by audiences. He's always really doing his own shtick, so much so that actually in the text of Much Ado About Nothing, where he plays the officious constable Dogberry, the speech prefixes are Kemp, not Dogberry. You know, it's more or less saying Kemp, do your Kemp stuff here. You'll be being Kemp. Kemp leaves the company possibly on bad terms at the end of the 16th century in 1599, and there must have been some kind of recruitment process or scouting because a comic actor, a new comic actor is needed, and the company get someone called Robert Armin, who has a different skill set and brings a different kind of comedy, more melancholic, more reflective, more musical, and the plays shift, I think, because of that. So they definitely must have been doing that, and they were certainly scouting for new actors to play female roles, because when young men did grow out of that, they grew out of being able to do that convincingly, not immediately when their voices broke, but sort of by their early 20s, they moved on from that. So definitely, I think there must have been some scouting.
Thank you. So perhaps there's for now a respite in questions.
What about, have you got David's question about?
I think perhaps I thought to insert it later because it talks also about writing. So I think that might.
No, you're absolutely right. Sorry, I should have trusted you to have done that. Great. Well, thank you for that. Let me move on to the next section that I wanted to talk about, which is about writing and collaboration. So I suppose everything we've said so far would be true of any theatre writer. It's a truism, really, isn't it, to say that theatre is a collaborative art, that it requires actors and musicians, costume makers and prompters and all that kind of thing. It's been more controversial to argue that Shakespeare wrote collaboratively, that he wrote with other writers. And that's the bit I want to talk about now. So we know from evidence of other, let me start that again. The best document we have for how theatre worked in this period, unfortunately, is not about Shakespeare's company, but about one of their rival companies, the Admiral's Men. And it's a document called Henslow's Diary, Philip Henslow's Diary. It's a sort of collection of accounts and various things. From that, we can piece out some of how box office takings seem to have worked, and how much money was paid for different aspects of performance, how much was paid for costumes, what was paid for scripts, and so on. And one of the things we can see from Henslow's accounts is that the vast majority of plays that are put on by his theatre company are collaborative. He pays multiple authors, sometimes groups of names that seem to be sort of writing cartels in some way. He pays them sometimes all at the same time, as if the work has been divided up from the get-go. He pays sometimes writers to tidy up scripts, or do sort of editing work, or do revival work, or do completion work when other writers have let him down. So there are different forms of collaborative writing for which we have evidence, which we can bring to the question of Shakespeare as collaborator. And there are sort of three main areas that I want to talk about. One is perhaps the division of a play between two writers to get the play done, and perhaps as part of a kind of apprenticeship model or a mentoring model, where a more experienced writer does the more difficult bits, and a more junior writer is subcontracted to do some perhaps more formulaic bits. Sometimes that model works where it's someone who writes comic bits is subcontracted to do a subplot. And sometimes there is a model where one writer gets the play going and writes the beginning and says, right, over to you now. I've set it all up. You just need to finish. So these are interesting models of how collaborative composition might work, and they all seem to be models in which we think Shakespeare might have participated. So early in his career, the plays that are on the historical reign of King Henry VI and the early tragedy Titus Andronicus, these are thought to be collaborations in which Shakespeare is a junior partner. He is perhaps adding not particularly, not the majority perhaps of those plays, or he's heavily drawing on planning or early drafts by other writers. So that suggests, because of where that comes in his career, that suggests perhaps that collaboration comes early on. And sometimes people talk about that in terms of the sort of school of Michelangelo kind of idea, that there are apprentices to the master, and perhaps some of those apprentices will become masters themselves in due course. And to bookend that experience of early Shakespeare, we've got late Shakespeare, where we know that Shakespeare collaborates with John Fletcher. So Fletcher is a younger writer. He's going to take over that house playwright role with the King's Men when Shakespeare retires. And he and Shakespeare are writing together a play about Henry VIII, a play called Two Noble Kinsmen, and in fact a play which we've lost based on one of the stories in Don Quixote, a play called Cardenio. So that would seem to suggest that there it's Fletcher who's the sort of starting out writer, and this is Shakespeare at the end of his career, sort of handing over in a way to a more junior collaborative partner. And that was a model of how collaborative writing might work, with which we were satisfied for a long part of Shakespeare's critical history. And I think we were satisfied with it because it left the plays that we all thought were really important and really good untouched by collaboration. So all the big tragedies, the plays that everybody knows about, they all seem to be Shakespeare's soul. And we could sacrifice some of these more marginal plays in the canon to the idea of collaboration as an apprentice model, and then as a kind of early retirement kind of model. That seemed to work in our model of an artistic career. But in fact, I think the picture has become much more complicated and much more interesting since then. And maybe this takes us back to, there are lots of different points to this, but maybe let's go back to Edward's question about Shakespeare manuscripts. So Edward asked whether it's true that there are no Shakespeare manuscripts extant, and it is true, except that a number of scholars would argue that Shakespeare's handwriting is present in a couple of places in a manuscript play called The Book of Sir Thomas More. The Book of Sir Thomas More is a manuscript held in the British Library, and the so-called Hand D, there are a number of different handwritings in it. Hand D is thought by many people to be by Shakespeare, to be Shakespeare's. The most interesting thing about the Book of Thomas More, I think, is that it really is a document of how collaboration might have worked over a relatively long period. People kept picking up this manuscript play and thinking, can we actually get this going? Can we make something of this? Can we get this performed? It's not clear whether the play ever was performed. And one role for Shakespeare probably around 1600. So at a which is the year he's probably writing Hamlet, writing just after Julius Caesar. This is, is at a significant point in his career. It's not just starting out. Around 1600, it looks as if Shakespeare is one of the writers who's been brought in to try to get this play into production, and he writes some big speeches for the central character Thomas More, which are about addressing a mob, an anti-immigrant mob in London, and More addresses them, saying, virtually saying, how would you like it if this were you? Think about it. Think about yourself as the migrant here. How would that be? So this is interesting because if it is by Shakespeare, it suggests that even when he was writing his own major plays, he was still available to write a few speeches for a collaborative one. It's interesting because one of the collaborators in the text is the censor, the Lord Chamberlain, who has some views about this toxic migrant story, anti-migrant story, and doesn't want to stir up problems in contemporary London. So he's trying to get them to tone that down. So it's an interesting document about how theatre plays work at the centre of lots of different factors and lots of different pressures. You may be able to tell from my own sense that even though I'm very, very interested in Shakespeare as a collaborator, I'm very pleased to pursue that line in new ways and creative ways. Excuse me, I'm not completely convinced that the Book of Thomas More does have Shakespeare's writing in it. Partly on the old principle that if it's too good to be true, then it probably isn't true, and that it's a little bit, because we have hardly any of Shakespeare's handwriting, we can't really do that kind of test. And the main proof that this work is by Shakespeare is because it seems good. That's one thing, but he's not the only capable playwright writing at that time. And it seems liberal and forward thinking. It seems like the kind of thing we would want Shakespeare to have written, even if he didn't. And that it seems like the thing that we would imagine Shakespeare writing. So when, for example, in 2016, we were celebrating one of the endless Shakespeare anniversaries, this speech from Thomas More, which spoke so directly to terrible humanitarian crisis in the Mediterranean, about migration, this became the sort of preeminent Shakespeare speech. If you Google it, you will see Ian McKellen reading it, and lots of other notable actors reading it, because it seemed so appropriate and so present and so urgent and so humane, which are the things we would want Shakespeare to be. Now, I want Shakespeare to be those things as much as anyone else, but I don't think he always is. And I think there is a sort of wish fulfillment there, as there is in much of this conversation about what Shakespeare wrote or didn't write, with which I'd want to, with which I feel a bit uncomfortable. So there's that possibility that there is patching, what's called patching, dropping in a real brilliant speech, and not really integrated with the rest of the play particularly. And then there are other forms of collaborative writing, some of which are perhaps post Shakespearean, and some of those are the most interesting ones. And here I suppose I want to talk just for a few minutes about Thomas Middleton. So Thomas Middleton is another playwright, again about a generation younger than Shakespeare. He is in some ways the opposite of that humane picture of Shakespeare that I just sketched out. His plays are very they're full of appetite. People are driven by money and by lust and by a kind of amoral energy. He's very interested in the civic environment and in the kind of the ways in which people are all out to cheating each other, and the plays have this great sort of livid energy, and at the end of a Middleton comedy, everybody sort of has to admit we've probably all been a bit less than we should have been. It's probably best not to ask too many questions about people's past. Let's just let it all go. Let's just let it lie. It's very different from those revelations and declarations which are at the end of Shakespeare's comedies. Middleton's much more about evasion and the kind of grown-up lies we tell each other and we tell ourselves. I really like Middleton as a writer. We think that Middleton and Shakespeare collaborated on a play which has always been a bit of a failure, and that's the play Timon of Athens. That's unfortunate. It's unfortunate that Timon of Athens is not much admired, because in some way the great problem about collaboration in artistic circles has been the suggestion that to be collaborative, a work is always incoherent or broken-backed or disconnected in some way. So there are a couple of genres, I think, modern genres in which we can accept collaborative writing. Screenwriting, I think, is one. Comedy writing, I think, is another. And we accept that, I feel, because we imagine that the collaborative partnership is more than the sum of its parts. It becomes a new creative engine, which is harmonious and sort of complete. Whereas we're not so keen on the idea that, I mean, we all know that Mozart's Requiem is not mostly written by Mozart, but we still call it Mozart's Requiem. And I think that slight feeling that to say something is collaborative requires some kind of artistic defense or artistic kind of excuse is still with us. And so the Timon of Athens example, where we think Shakespeare worked with Middleton, in some ways plays into that narrative that collaboration is not always artistically successful. But Middleton has more to say in Shakespeare's career, and here I think things are really get more interesting. If I can just do a brief diversion about Shakespeare's plays in print, you'll see why I'm doing that in a moment. About half of Shakespeare's plays, I use about because the question of how many plays Shakespeare actually wrote, as we're seeing, is a little bit difficult. But about half of Shakespeare's plays were published as single play editions during his lifetime. But half of them have to wait until the first folio that we've already mentioned, which doesn't come out until 1623, 7 years after Shakespeare's death. They're not published until that point. And some of those plays had their first performances 20 or more years previously. So a play like Julius Caesar, which was performed when the Globe first opened in 1599, doesn't go into print until 24 years later in 1623. All those plays have been in manuscript. Presumably, those manuscripts are now lost. Back to Edward's question, had been in manuscript in the King's Men's repertoire or kind of props cupboard library, and they had almost certainly been subject to alteration at different scales in the meantime. So that's to say, the text of Julius Caesar that was published in 1623 was almost certainly not the text that was published in 1599, that was performed in 1599. It was almost bound to have been updated for a revival at some point in the intervening time. And we can see that once we recognize that that's the case, we can see that lots of problems about apparent sources and references in Shakespeare's plays become less problematic. So, for example, Measure for Measure, which is a play we traditionally date to 1604, has a lot of allusions to the politics of the 1618 and 1619, and we were always kind of completely puzzled by this. But it seems quite likely that Measure for Measure is one of the plays that was revived and rewritten to some extent for that revival. Most importantly, that it was rewritten not by Shakespeare, probably because it was after Shakespeare's death. And the candidate we think rewrote that play was Middleton. And having established that, we have moved elsewhere in the canon to suggest that Macbeth and All's Well That Ends Well are also Middleton post hoc collaborations. That's to say, there was a Shakespeare play which has been worked over and reworked by Middleton. What we have is the Shakespeare-Middleton mashup. We don't have anymore the original Shakespeare play before Middleton got his hands on it. Now that's valuable. It's contentious. It's not absolutely shared by across the field of Shakespeare criticism, and this is a very heated field that people feel very, very strongly about. But if it's true, it's interesting that it allows us to see an acknowledged masterpiece like Macbeth as a collaborative play, and so it allows us to put to modify a bit the aesthetic assumptions that usually go with collaboration. The counter to that would be to say that the signs that a play is collaborative are usually signs of the clues that a play is collaborative are usually clues that are about discontinuities of some sort. So I should declare an interest here in that with a colleague of mine, collaboratively, with Laurie Maguire, we proposed that All's Well That Ends Well was a Middleton was a Middleton rewrite, and what put us onto that was points of discrepancy and discontinuity in the play, which seemed to us to suggest that two writers actually had two quite different senses of what was going on and what characters were called and how to think about the plot of the play. And from that, we produce some of the stylistic evidence and the vocabulary evidence that's used. Other critics would use much more sustained computer analysis, stylometric analysis than I'm qualified to do. But this is an emerging field in Shakespeare studies. At the moment, there is pretty broad agreement about collaboration of different kinds in about a quarter of Shakespeare's works. But I think that figure will go up. I would predict that figure will go up over the next couple of decades. I think that's where a lot of the energy in Shakespeare studies is right now, in trying to work out the status of the text in Shakespeare's plays and the extent of Shakespeare's collaborative writing. And I think the big prize will be to find that collaboration can be behind plays which we think of as artistically successful and unified, not just an explanation for plays that we think for some reason or another are less so. So I've tried to sketch out a kind of pattern of Shakespeare's career in which collaboration of different sorts that takes quite different models is not only part of the beginning and the end of his career, which we've thought for a long time, but that it's part of the middle period as well, that collaboration is quite probably a part of some play texts that we think highly of and that are performed as solely Shakespearean. Perhaps they need to be reconsidered as collaborative. Now, in some ways, you might say that the collaboration, why would that make any difference? Why does it matter who wrote the plays? And I've got quite a lot of sympathy with that. I do think as a wider aesthetic category, it would be good to recognize that collaborative work can be successful, can pass, if you like, as single authored work, because of those aspects of negative disapprobation that tend to apply to the collaborative mode. Maybe I'll stop there. Yeah.
Fascinating. And again, questions from everyone are welcome, and I'll lead off with a couple referring to what you just mentioned. Middleton, is he also a bit like Shakespeare, an actor and a playwright, or is he? Do we know him only concentrating on the writing? And that being a part of the larger question, how common is it for the actors to be playwrights at the time and writers? Where if I make a parallel with the music world, at that time, certainly, and much later, the whole idea of a separation of the performer and the writer in music, the composer, was not the prevailing model. But what is it in Shakespeare's theatre and in his circle, Middleton being part of it?
That's a great question. Yeah, Middleton is not an actor, so far as we know, nor is Marlowe an actor. And so it does seem as if Shakespeare maybe certainly Shakespeare's actor-writer profile is not necessarily completely standard. Yeah, and there are other. I was just thinking about other writers of the period and what we know about their background. John Webster has legal training. He isn't an actor either. So I think there are relatively few actors who are successful playwrights in this period.
Fascinating. So, and with this larger, let's say, aesthetic category that you mentioned about, well, how important is it who wrote it? And I think there's a lot of anxiety this provokes in people, also in let's say consumers of these artworks, because perhaps, and I would love to know your thoughts on that, it seems that we're very much children of the Romantic age that very much glorified the soul figure that you were referring to, and so I think often people are very anxious to appreciate an artwork that's not attributed, so to say. So be that a composition, it immediately becomes greater if so and so wrote it, and I would imagine there's at least as many people that would say, oh, it's not important who wrote it, that actually are very disturbed by the fact, well, who wrote Macbeth and did one person write it? But what's your feeling?
Yeah, completely. I mean, I think one aspect of that is it speaks to our anxiety about our discernment. So one collaborative play is the play Pericles, where most critics believe that George Wilkins wrote the first act or so, and then Shakespeare took over. And either because they believe that, or this is why they believe it, they feel that there is such an obvious change in the artistic merit of the play that it's completely obvious when Shakespeare picks up his pen. And once someone says that to you, it's very difficult, isn't it, to say, actually, is that true? Because you look immediately as if you have no taste and you can't tell the difference between George Wilkins, who's ever heard of him, and Shakespeare, the greatest playwright ever. And there becomes a sort of emperor's new clothes about it that nobody dares say, because it seems to attach itself to their own, something quite important about their own taste and their own, how they manage. I don't see that in Pericles. and but it's very common if you say that people people do go to this sort of value judgment, that it's clear that the poetry is just better at this point than it was before. So I think that's one of the anxieties, that you know, if we didn't know this was Shakespeare, would we know, how would we know whether it was any good or not? That really gets to the heart, really, of what we do, isn't it? And we know from attribution studies elsewhere that, you know, the painting that nobody's looked at for years and then suddenly is, you know, seen to be a Leonardo or something. These are quite chastening moments, aren't they? You think, you know, would I have noticed that? Probably not.
Yes, and well, and we're hosted by Kronberg Academy, that originally now includes pianists, but grows out of the string playing world, and then of course in violin or string instrument dealings, this is particularly pertinent. Well, this is a great sounding instrument, but is it really a Stradivari? Is it really a Guarneri? Or is it still a Guarneri when 65% of the parts and the wood has been replaced by people through the centuries? So it brings us to the core of aesthetics of
it
art.
Really does. Yeah, there's a great example of this, which is the Shakespeare's play Titus Andronicus, which has a very, very gory tragedy. It's a made up Roman history. It's in very bad taste. The play. It's a very you know, so for some people have seen it quite a campy or sort of over the top, even a horror kind of play. It doesn't seem sublime like a tragedy. And people for years have felt this couldn't have been by Shakespeare because it's so tasteless. And there's really quite recently there's been a big there was a very important edition of the play by one of my colleagues, Jonathan Bate, who mounted the first really major aesthetic defense of this play and said it's a completely brilliant play. It's a very it's ironic, it knows it's doing this, it's playing with our ideas of revulsion, and it's very sort of postmodern in lots of ways. And in order to make that case that this is a really good play, Jonathan also said, and this suggestion that it was co-written is just wrong. This is completely Shakespeare, and it's Shakespeare at his best. He established the case that Titus was a worthy play and an interesting play and a stage-worthy play, and stimulated lots more work in it. And when he did a second edition, he was able to admit, yeah, and actually probably George Peele was responsible for at least some of it. But he obviously couldn't make the both arguments at the same time. He couldn't say this is a really valuable play and really clever and artistically canny play, and it is written collaboratively. It was not, they couldn't be made, those arguments that couldn't be made together.
Question from Pamela Raponi. Under this perspective of Shakespeare as a collaborator, is it possible to think then that when he consulted the Holinshed Chronicles for plays such as Macbeth, was he probably doing a collaborative research with other writers? Thank you for this marvelous seminar.
Pamela, that's a great idea, and it's interesting to think there's a role that we don't know, we're not completely sure about in this whole model of writing, which is a role called a plotter. And it does seem that the plotter, I think there are probably equivalents in TV drama. They do a kind of treatment, and they leave the fleshing out of the speeches to writers, but they shape out the entire play. We don't know whether Shakespeare worked as a plotter for other writers, but we do know that plotters often are drawing on pre-existing sources like Holinshed's Chronicles, or that possibly that a pre-existing source could be the shared material that a group of writers together are hanging their writing on or kind of working off. I think that's a great idea.
You mentioned something about also the computer analysis techniques right at the end of your previous section. There's a question from Janet Riemenschneider-Kemp. How important are vocabulary, spelling, and syntax in trying to analyze, quote unquote, whose hand is behind a script?
Yeah, that's a good question, Janet. So one of the sort of analog method, so the pre-digital method, was very heavily influenced by vocabulary, shared vocabulary, and felt that shared vocabulary or shared phrases, overlapping phrases, was the sign of sort of shared authorship, and that's how you distinguished an authorial signature, that you were particularly interested in unusual words that might only be used, or unusual phrases that might only be used by a particular writer. But what computer analysis has done is to flip that really on its head, and that computer analysis is more interested in tiny, unimportant words, so-called function words, that it's hard, and it's interested in those because speakers and writers find those very hard to change, whereas they can import bits of vocabulary, and do import bits of vocabulary from other writers, or even style from other writers, but how you use just tiny ordinary bits of language like to or at or something, that's become much more important. We know that one of Middleton's signatures, for example, is an abbreviated, is the use of the apostrophe to abbreviate, out a syllable. So he will say isn't, or weren't, what, rather than were not, or is not. So that's even where the sort of rhythm doesn't particularly require that. So it's an interesting way in which what we can observe as readers, which tends to be the exceptional things, is different from what computers can detect, which is the unexceptional.
And as a rough estimation, in your view, have these techniques generated some unexpected insights or some unexpected claims that such and such thing is or isn't of that person? Are these techniques yielding information that you wouldn't have come to with
I think they are.
methods?
They're extremely controversial, perhaps because they're not widely understood, and because we have gone through a period where humanities scholars have used sort of quasi-scientific or quantitative techniques in ways which it has not been possible to quite reproduce the results. So there have been sort of difficulties about the data set, and difficulties about the methods, and difficulties in some ways about the computer programs that have been used, which have been adapted from the kinds of plagiarism programs that universities use to mark student work sometimes, and a program that was originally designed by the American Civil Liberties Union, I think, to try to prove that certain confessions by American kind of prisoners could not have been written by their putative authors. So these are interesting frameworks to bring to the Shakespeare text, but they're not exactly necessarily quite perfectly adapted to the task. So I think there is some skepticism about them. One of the things I think have been found most interesting, the one thing that's been most interesting to me about it, is that where we think Shakespeare has collaborated or has been collaborated on by Middleton, it is one of the ways of seeing that is that Shakespeare's linguistic forms, this is back to Janet's question, are more old-fashioned than Middleton's. There's a great, language is always changing. The new form in Shakespeare's England of the verb to go is I went, and that's the form that Middleton uses. The form that Shakespeare uses is I did go, which is the old form. And it's so striking to me just to think that Shakespeare, whose language we always think about as being so modern and having such an impact on modern English, and so inventive and so creative, also had ways in which he was a provincial boy, speaking speaking a language which was not quite current among the Londoners of the next generation.
And Janet had a follow-up question. And do you think Shakespeare wrote Arden of Feverism?
I don't know, Janet. I don't know whether Shakespeare wrote Arden of Faversham. There's a slight feeling that Arden of Faversham is a good play, and therefore Shakespeare must have written it. I respect the scholar who's done most to if I were to be on sides in the scholarly debate, the scholar who has done most to prosecute the argument that Shakespeare did write Arden of Faversham is a scholar I respect and admire, and the people who say Shakespeare didn't write Arden of Faversham are the people I tend not to agree with. So it's all stacking up, but I'm not sure. I'm really not sure.
Sophia Raman asks, you spoke about present-day actors using speeches that resonate with contemporary issues, such as from the Thomas More play. Could you tell us a bit about how theatre makers might handle speeches that are more problematic for a modern audience, for example, Merchant of Venice?
It's really important, isn't it? It's and I think partly the attraction of that Thomas More speech was precisely to take the spotlight away from other speeches where that's not what we get at all. I do think that if we were to think about Shylock, I think that in Merchant of Venice, I do think that Shakespeare's characterization of Shylock is in excess of what would be needed to make him an anti-Semitic stereotype. And I think it's quite useful. I found it quite a useful sort of diagnosis of Shakespeare's method to be in excess of. That's to say more than is necessary. And Shylock is a much more complicated character and given much more complicated speeches than he would need to be if the only point were to make him into an anti-Semitic caricature. I think that sort of giving that some space is probably the way that theatre makers need to deal with that. But I'm not opposed. I'm not fundamentally opposed to ideas. I'm not fundamentally opposed to those people who feel that the Merchant of Venice should not be performed as casually or as readily as it is. I wouldn't cancel the Merchant of Venice, but I would completely support those who feel that it is actually more trouble than it's worth, and that there are other plays one might do instead.
Though, of course, this gets us. We are right. I find on the splicing point of, on one hand, collaborative writing and sort of posthumous collaborative writing when plays are changed. On the other hand, we have the danger to possibly lapse into cleansing and correcting historical artifacts.
We always have. I mean, we have choices, don't we? There's limited programming. That there's a difference between cleansing and censoring, and amplifying, isn't there? And putting on a play, performing a play, is an act of amplification. And we could just not perform it. That we don't need to burn it, or we don't need to tear it up. I'm not particularly advocating that, but I sometimes think we are so invested in the idea that Shakespeare is a modern, fundamentally liberal writer whose works are part of what's best about our culture, that we can't see or are unwilling to see the places where actually he is firmly in the 16th century and could be left there.
And then, of course, there is, you very briefly touched upon it, and this is, well, either a very long discussion or a very short discussion, but I think there is desire in our romanticizing of the great creators that they ought to be also very good and moral beings, and moral beings that should suit all eras from now on to eternity. And especially, I think, with the examination and constant examination of complex lives and complex circumstances, I think we're ending up in a place, well, there are no heroes. Nobody is a hero, and nobody stands up to such scrutiny.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting, isn't it? I think it's so interesting that literary criticism was so into the sort of the death of the author, the idea that it's readers who make the meaning. Meaning is all in reception, not production, and we've thrown that out when we find that the authors are people who are not admirable in one way or another. I think we're very confused about that, and about whether art should reflect back to us our own views. I mean, that the sort of echo chamber problem, which is probably the problem of our times. I mean, the answer to that is exposing yourself to unpleasant or unlikable or disagreeable material, and probably not many of us have the sort of, I don't know if it is the moral courage, but the courage to do that.
Yes, that seems to be, that's for another historian, but that seems to be a changing trend where even if one reads correspondence between creative personalities 100 years ago, maybe 70 years ago, there are tremendous disagreements that you would say are expressed in such ways that I think under today's social contract would prohibit further contact or further friendship. Yet we know that those friendships continued and lasted. So it's
we're in a difficult place, aren't we, where there's a lot of vitriol and not much debate. You know, we've lost the ability to debate properly, and to separate out views from people, I think. But we also we've also that doesn't mean that everybody agrees. We've got the worst side of that, which is also, you know, terrible abuse against people with whom, you know, people on Twitter or whatever don't agree with. I think we're in a difficult place about disagreement. I feel that a lot working in the university. I think a lot of our students feel that our students do not actually feel that freedom of speech is a fundamental value, whereas I think in my generation we did think that was the progressive value, freedom of speech. Now, perhaps this is beyond our topic, but it's interesting how Shakespeare sort of touches on lots of things. I think freedom of speech in the university sector, as I experienced it in the UK, now seems to be the project of the right, whereas it was the progressive left-wing project, you know, 30 years ago. And I don't quite know how that happened.
Well, things turn, literally.
Things do turn.
So, but perhaps we should, there are a couple more questions which we'll get to, but perhaps we should let you continue with, I think you said there's the third part of what
so I've got a briefer third part, which perhaps will help us to think through so bring together some of these themes. So I'll just talk about that briefly, so we've got a little bit more time for questions. So I wanted to think about sort of adaptation as a form of collaboration, and here I want to think both about Shakespeare as an adapter and as if you like, an adaptee, both the material that adapts something prior to it and then the material that has been used for adapters ever since. And I want to think about this as a more sort of extended form of creative collaboration. David has put in the chat to panelists, perhaps not everybody else can see it, that the degree to which Shakespeare used source material suggests he was very far from wanting to write wholly autonomous works. And that's a really important element of writing culture in this period. I sometimes say that if you went to an MFA or a writing program now, you probably one of the pieces of advice you would be given is write about what you know. That kind of authenticity is what we are looking for in a lot of our fiction writing right now. If there had been such a thing as those writing classes in the Elizabethan period, the advice would have been actually really quite different. It would have been write about what you have read. That to be a writer, you did not have to have had experiences. That was not your source material. You needed to have done your research. You needed to have read the stuff, and you needed to be absorbing and transforming and reworking that stuff quite visibly in your own writing. That's what gave you the authority to speak. So the idea of originality has changed enormously, and the value of originality has changed enormously over these 400 years. And one of the things that always strikes me about that plagiarism software that I mentioned, it's called Turnitin, that's used to distinguish Shakespeare from his collaborators, also actually would turn up a huge amount of what we would now call plagiarism in Shakespeare's sole authored works. That's to say, places where he has directly used, where it's quite clear he has a particular book open on his writing desk and is copying out, making some running changes or some running repairs on the syntax or the prosody of those sentences, but bringing them straight into really a kind of an analog version of cut and paste. We see that most famously in the Enobarbus's speech about Cleopatra in Antony and Cleopatra, which comes straight out of Thomas North's translation of Plutarch. So source material is absolutely crucial to Shakespeare's writing. It is not hidden, and it's his calling card. It's his calling card for saying, I've got the qualifications to write. He brings the source, one of his most frequently used sources, Ovid's Metamorphoses, translated, probably the translated version, but he also would have read Latin. He brings that source into as a book into one of his plays, into Titus Andronicus. So it becomes a prop within the fiction as well as the prop for the fiction itself. So it's again a kind of a knowing nod to the source material. So Shakespeare, it's interesting to think about Shakespeare as an adapter, as someone who sees prior texts in different forms and thinks this would make a play, or this and this added together would make a play, or I can draw on that to create this, or I can shape this historical passage into this particular arc, dramatic arc. Now, if Shakespeare then is an adapter, maybe that helps us see a longer line of responses to his work as adaptations, and as a sort of a longer creative chain. And again, I'm sort of thinking back to my opening position of thinking about Shakespeare on a pedestal. And to reiterate, it's not that I want to cut Shakespeare down to size, it's that I'd like us to be more in contact with him, and more in contact with the kind of creative energy that I think his plays have held and can hold for readers and theatre makers and creative thinking of all kinds. So if we think about Shakespeare as one point in the kind of in the mutation of this material from sources which predate him into texts and media which postdate him, that's one way to think about a more productive kind of creative relationship. So, for example, in Macbeth, Shakespeare uses Holinshed's chronicles, the Chronicles of Scotland, for the first and only time in his writing, presumably to impart to focus and direct his work towards the new Scottish king, James VI and First. What he finds in Holinshed's Chronicles is a picture of Scotland in which might is right. It's an absolute sort of dog-eat-dog world. So the Scotland in which Duncan is the ruler has seen Duncan come to the throne through violence, and he has held on to power. He is getting old and losing his control, and Macbeth is the up-and-coming new ruler who in turn, through violence, takes over the throne. And the Holinshed's view of Scotland in this period is that it's an absolute, it's sort of barren, warrior baron kind of war chiefs kind of rule. If you've got the army, you can take over, and that's how succession works. Now, Shakespeare completely changes that, or almost completely changes that, so that Duncan becomes, who is the king that Macbeth murders, Duncan becomes the anointed king, God's representative, the saintly, morally upright, justified, legal king. And when Macbeth kills him, that overturns everything. That upturns the whole of nature. Everything is at odds, and it's the rest of the course of the play to get things back on track and to reinstate Duncan's proper heir, who is his oldest son, Malcolm. So that's to say, Shakespeare brings in not only the divine right of kings, but also primogeniture, the inheritance of the eldest son. And he imposes these models, which are completely important and central to Stuart London and to Stuart England, his own context, but are not part of the medieval Scotland that he's writing about at all. What has happened in later adaptations of Macbeth, from Ubu Roy, Alfred Jarry, through to a film like Justin Kurzel's film with Michael Fassbender as Macbeth. What all kinds of adapters of Macbeth have wanted to do, and I don't know whether they've done it knowingly, is actually to take us back to that. To a less morally certain world than Shakespeare seems to give us, and to amplify the role of violence, the cycles of violence that are still there in Shakespeare's play, but that are closer in some ways to the source from which he took it. And so Macbeth feels to me like a traveling story. A traveling set of tropes and kind of story ideas that predate Shakespeare, that Shakespeare instantiates in some really important ways, but that then is still alive and open to be adapted later on. And that form of collaboration, that long form of collaboration across time, feels to me in some ways the most valuable reason, the most important reason for us to care about Shakespeare now, is to care about not the historical situation, interesting as that is, not Shakespeare in his own context, important as that has been for scholarship, but Shakespeare as really as a resource for creativity since then. And collaboration in its widest sense allows us to link the practices that I've tried to say were actually intrinsic to Shakespeare to the wider history of Shakespearean reception, and to authorize, if authority is needed, the adaptation and changing and cutting and reforming of Shakespeare in our own time. I think people always expect me as a professor of Shakespeare in quite a conservative old style university to be all about Shakespeare as he was, or Shakespeare as he should have been. But in fact, I'm actually all about Shakespeare as something that we and creative people in our world and in other worlds too can be can engage with and can work with and can make new things from.
Wonderful. It's a wonderful call to action, or to call to arms, and I'm sure some people are provoked in various ways by this suggestion. But essentially, what you're finally talking about is, let's say, interpretation or reinterpretation versus recreation and creation, and that rather than engaging in interpretation, perhaps Shakespeare is a catalyst to recreation, which I think also we as musicians can certainly relate to and find ourselves, I think, in a very similar place, where one hand there is the accuracy and the excitement about the discovery that is indeed a C sharp, and yet you have somebody like, well, we can name anybody from Busoni to Stravinsky to Thomas Adès, who comes and takes the material and reforms it in their own way. And do you think Shakespeare delivered different, let's say, plot outcomes depending on the audience he was catering to? Because we had a very interesting seminar with Ivan Fischer, the great Hungarian conductor, who talked about Monteverdi's Orfeo, and his one of his main arguments, as far as I could understand, was that the two different versions of what happens with Orfeo and Monteverdi's opera is perhaps because one was deemed not such an uplifting one for the court delivery, so then there's another one produced. Is that something you can find in Shakespeare, that there was this flexibility, let's say, in plot and moral outcomes, or rather that he does insist on his view as the creator?
Well, I think there's a huge amount of flexibility in the outcomes, and I think probably, like as you've just described Monteverdi, Shakespeare probably is writing, is slightly re-angling his plays for court performances or for public performances. I imagine that those works, those would have been importantly distinct. So there is a sense of the audience. And I think more broadly, Shakespeare's success in his own time is probably largely due to the ways in which he kind of understands what audiences want, and doesn't present. I mean, Shakespeare is innovative in lots of ways, but he is appropriately kind of commercially innovative. That's to say, I think he's innovative in ways which audiences can cope with and can step along with him, rather than avant-garde and difficult or alienating. So I think knowing the audience and what they will accept, and how far this play needs to be like the others and how far it can be different is an important element of Shakespeare's popularity.
And speaking about Shakespeare's popularity and connecting that to the fact that you, as you said, work in a renowned and very traditional university, I'm sure you have not missed the conversation that I think is particularly active in the United States, seemingly, about canceling the classics, and maybe not canceling the classics for any particular transgression, but generally, why should we be studying the classics? And I think this is sometimes extended. So why should we be studying Shakespeare? And of course, many of us have this sort of default, how can one even ask this? But when the question is out there already, what is your feeling and what is your possible defense when somebody comes and says, well, why are these old writings important, and why are these old creators important?
So I think there are lots of possible lines of defense about that. I mean, one is that I think it is part of our humanity to encounter things that are not like us. That's an important part of kind of human cultural interaction, and that would be the argument for the discomfort of the Merchant of Venice that we were talking about a few moments ago. So an encounter with the other is always a kind of bracing and potentially empathetic kind of enlarging kind of encounter. I guess with Shakespeare, another possibility is to say that the flip side of Shakespeare's reach and overpresence in world culture is that his works have become a resource for a kind of writing back or a kind of resistance in a way to the monolith. So I'm thinking about, for example, the French Martinique anti-colonial writer Aimé Césaire, who wrote a version of The Tempest, or a kind of a post-Tempest episode, using that play as a framework to really interrogate and challenge colonial stereotypes and colonial rule. And although there's obviously Audre Lorde's famous quotation that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, of course that's a very important it's very important to bear in mind. But there are ways in which Shakespeare's tools in some ways have been used to dismantle Shakespeare's house, or that Shakespeare's unarguable cultural weight has been used to leverage, good things or progressive developments in other ways. So, for example, the fact that in the UK, Shakespeare production is subsidised and well supported by audiences has meant that it has been the most prominent place to try and diversify casting, to make classical theatre roles open to actors of colour, and to really think about diversifying acting as a profession. Now, that's happened much more in Shakespeare, in performance of Shakespeare, than it has in performances of really any other writer. So there are some interesting and unexpected ways in which Shakespeare's cultural prominence can be used progressively as well as being used regressively. And I think Shakespeare, fundamentally, I think Shakespeare asks, if I'm giving a plug for my book, This is Shakespeare, what I say in that book is Shakespeare just asks questions. That's what the plays do. They ask questions, and at different times we have different answers for them. But the asking of questions is itself a fundamental, a kind of fundamental human necessity.
Yes, it's a beautiful answer. I think somewhere Simon Callow writes that Shakespeare is finally the one writer that is for everyone, and that the Russians found their quintessential 19th century gloom in him, and the oppressed writers the world over identified with his characters. So
yeah,
perhaps
and it's certainly there's been lots and lots of documented cases where Shakespeare somehow has not been subject to the kind of censorship that other sorts of work might be under certain regimes, and therefore it's been able to be used to speak certain kinds of truth to power.
In fact, there was a follow-up comment from Esther Orban, who says that The Merchant of Venice, in the right director's hands, can be very important to address the problem of anti-Semitism. Just before the lockdown, there was an important production in Hungary that really spoke strongly to the very present problem of minorities in society. So it all very much depends on the context. I wanted to ask you, I think I'm interested to know, and hopefully I think it's interesting for our participants, Your passion for Shakespeare scholarship, what are the roots? How so to say did you become the person that was on the Scottish island identifying yet another copy, or authenticating another copy of the first folio? So just on a personal note, can we have you trace that a little bit?
So I suppose, I mean, as a kind of bookish child, I mean, studied literature at university. I've never, I enjoy the theatre, but I've never been a performer or a director. I'm not, that's not what, that isn't a kind of strength of mine. And for a long time, I was working on popular theatre in the Elizabethan period, and about the plays that were sort of topical and have sunk, that we've never heard of. So I was interested in all the non-Shakespearean plays, and I was brought round to Shakespeare really for two related reasons. One is that the history of Shakespeare reception and what we have thought about Shakespeare is so expansive and so exciting because of that it's never ending, because as we've just heard, there is always an interesting production that does something different and that does something new. So you could never be on top of it, but it's always changing and it's always responding to now. It covers, if you're a Shakespearean, you can reasonably look at opera or graphic novels or textual variants or psychology. These are all different aspects, many others. So it's heterogeneous in ways which really appeal to me. And related to that is the reason I think I really have sort of stuck with Shakespeare is because so many people have an opinion about him. And it seems to me that academics can be either sort of evangelical for the small thing that only they know about, and that they're always telling people about it and saying, this is really interesting, you've probably never heard of it. Or they can be, sort of reflecting back something that people do already know about. And that second model is much better for me. I never wanted to be the person who was the world expert on a tiny thing that nobody else cared about. I would rather know a fraction of what there is to know, and always be in conversations like today with people who have something to bring, something to ask about, something to compare with that I didn't know before.
Oh, it's very convincing and touching, your reasoning. You just reminded me there's a nice interview about, and this is a little bit apropos, collaborations and schools and traditions, and about what you just said. There's a nice interview with Grigori Sokolov, the Russian pianist, and he was asked if what it is the Russian piano playing tradition, and he said, well, I don't really know, because take Richter and Gilels, very, very different, and the Soviet Union or Russia is very, very big and very diverse in every way. But he then said, well, you know how you walk into a museum and you see a painting and it says from the workshop or the school of Rembrandt, and then you see another painting that says unknown author from the 17th century. He says, well, so I'd rather be the unknown author, said Mr. Sokolov. And this is apropos also attribution and how much.
Yeah, that's really great.
I think as far as not belonging to a certain school, but rather just trying to be what you are. That's a very sympathetic statement. I want to thank you because you've been so generous with your time, and I want to thank everybody for taking part and for your questions that I think are an essential part of these gatherings, and I think were very stimulating for me, and I hope and imagine for Emma also, and of course the topic of Shakespeare will be a platitude and not an overstatement that it's inexhaustible, which just means that I hope that you'll agree to speak to us again, perhaps on other aspects, since there are so many, and we'll be looking forward to the book that is to come. And for those that haven't gotten or read Emma's book, This is Shakespeare, that I think is the next stop for all of us. And just very briefly, next week is going to be, well, we jump a couple of centuries, but we speak about another creative force, Orson Welles, and it's going to be Simon Callow that was talking to us about Shakespeare earlier, and he'll talk about Orson Welles and what that grand occurrence is and means for us. So I hope you'll join us on May 5th. You can register for the newsletter and receive the announcements for upcoming seminars. But most importantly, I just wanted to say a huge thank you to Emma for your time, for your knowledge, and for your passion, all of which are very inspiring.
Thank you so much.